right, good morning, everyone. How is view and audio?
Great, thank you.
All right, so I think people will trickle in. This workshop is going to cover two really big topics. So I have a lot of information in the slides. Some of them I may hit the main points and then kind of gloss over the really in-depth parts just so we can get through everything. But if you do have questions, I've got the chat pulled up. I can answer them out loud just because there is so much that goes into both collaborative research and international research and collaborative international research. So anything that is a UIS form for IRB is at this link. It is also on our resources page. And if you like to navigate through our website, it is also available by following the IRB breadcrumbs. Buttons work. All right, so as you can see, there is a lot. The PowerPoint is already available on our resources tab. Each of these hyperlinked items will take you to that specific page in this PowerPoint, just so you don't have to go through the 60 or so slides to find the one question answer that you have. So we're going to start with collaborating exclusively with UIS partners and what that training looks like, going into how that works with non-UIS collaborators. It more talks about people at other institutions who have IRBs. If you have a community partner or things like that, that's one of those it depends answers, and we can do that on a case-by-case basis. And when you are collaborating with non-UIS affiliates, there are two paths we can take. Coordinating is for those lower risk protocols, and then a lot others may require or suggest a single IRB review. And once I get through that portion, I'll pause and let you ask some questions if you have any. And then we'll get into the really big portion, which is international research, where we go over system and university and federal travel policies. We'll go into export control and what you need to know if you are either traveling yourself out of the country or if you are processing data over borders. That is also an export that a lot of people don't realize is something to be aware of. And then we'll look at some best practices for that travel. We will go through the international IRB checklist. We will talk about what travel advisories are, what sanctions and embargoes are, and it gets really, like I said, in depth. And then we'll look at international compilation of standards, which includes data privacy laws. Two really big ones are with the European Union and the People's Republic of China. And then probably a lot of questions will be there, so we'll have a question break. And then every page that I reference in here is on the resource page at the end, which you can just hop on the resource link if you only want that page as well. So, to start, I've already said it once, but so many things depend on the specifics of what you're doing. So like I said, if you're doing UIS collaborators, if you're doing domestic non-UIS collaborators, international, and then it depends on what exact country it is, it's a whole mess of it depends. We say it a lot, we joke about it, but it truly matters. So scenario one, we're looking at only UIS faculty, staff, or students. They are engaging in what is federally defined research activity with human subjects. So on the IRB application, it is this tiny little section 2, which just asks, are there other investigators engaged in research? So if it is research, that means that it is contributing to generalizable knowledge. And then if there are human subjects, those two definitions are met. So if someone else besides you is overseeing the project, implementing it, recruiting subjects is considered human subjects research. If they are only getting the informed consent, that is still part of the research. If they are collecting data, analyzing the data when it is in an identifiable form, if they are following up with subjects, all of those scenarios, you will answer, yes, there is a research team form beyond myself, or a research team beyond myself, so I need the form. Which separate document looks like this. In previous trainings, I've gone over how to fill this out. So this is just not going to go that in depth. But you would choose that they are an affiliate of the University of Illinois Springfield. And with that, there is required city training. Again, I've gone into that more in depth in other trainings. If you have questions, please feel free to email me and I will give you that more in-depth version. But the overview is log in or register, add your course. The course is always going to be core IRB training for everyone that is on your research team. And this only applies to your UIS affiliates. The core IRB training is not necessarily called that at other universities. That is the UIS and UIUC specific training. And then, of course, if you are doing international research, in question 2, there is one extra little check mark to make sure you do. It is only one quiz instead of the 5 quizzes required for the core IRB. And then to prove that you have done it, you'll go to your records. Make sure you are looking at the proper course. Some people screenshot this page, which is not in-depth enough for us to know what you got on each quiz. So you do need to go to the view, print, share, and get the completion report. That will break it down into the scores. The certificate does not. Again, not enough detail on that. So if you have completed both, you will have the 5 scores for core IRB and one little quiz for your international research. If you did not get 80% on one of your quizzes, you can retake it. The score shows up on page 2, or if you've taken a lot of them, maybe page 3, but it will never show up on page 1. Page 1 is a frozen report. So we check those scores. So UIS seems a little easier if you're doing those collaborations. Now, of course, we want to encourage external collaboration. We are not saying that you should not do that. We're not trying to hinder that opportunity for you, but there are more things that go into that. So with non-UIS affiliated collaborators, there are those 2 options I said. So if each site is conducting a different research activity, we may suggest that you coordinate reviews with the other locations' IRBs. We can help facilitate those conversations. But that way, our IRB is only doing the UIS portion. Their IRB is doing their site location. That's called coordinated. And the other option, which is required in some cases and maybe suggested in others, is when all sites are following the same protocol, or we ask you to combine everything into the same protocol. That is called a single IRB, also called an SIRB. And one site will oversee the multi-site study for everyone. And looking at that, again, a lot of information. So with coordinated reviews, each site has its own lead investigator, but they will align their applications to be what is happening on their site. If that is the case, you do not need a research team because we are not overseeing those collaborators. You do not need a research team form unless you have other UIS collaborators. Let me clear that up. So with that, we need to make sure that your consent form says that you might be sharing data, and it should specifically say that it's going outside of UIS, and they should know exactly what's being done with their data. So if you are sharing raw data, they need to know that that's being shared. If you are only sharing de-identified data, they need to know that their identities are not being shared, but their information might be. Aggregated data, if that is the only thing, that may not even be considered human subjects, but that's a deeper conversation. So coordinated reviews can only be used for protocols that meet the federal definition of exempt. If it is above exempt and there are multiple sites, it does have to be legally a single IRB review. Exempt studies can be done by a single IRB. It is required for federally funded projects with human subjects research, but we also might encourage it just to make changes to the protocol easier. So only one change has to be made and not a change at every single site. And if it is coordinated, though we don't require having them on the research team form, we are not overseeing them. We do still want to see proof that it has been approved at their site to show that we are doing our due diligence and everything is being, keeping the integrity of the research and keeping our subjects safe. And then the hardest thing about the coordinated reviews is that any change that impacts our protocol will require an amendment to be made. So that is the one case where we might encourage a single IRB review, especially if there are 10 sites, that's 10 different IRBs that now have to make changes. And that process and timeline can take a long time. So a single IRB review is sometimes called a reliance. We might say we're deferring, or it might be an institutional authorization. All of those things are the same title, just that official name is called single IRB review. So an entire application is only submitted to one IRB. They are called the lead IRB, the IRB of record, the prime, lots of different words that mean the same thing. And that one location has oversight for everyone at every location. The non-lead IRBs will ask to do a context review, meaning, especially if it's in a different state, we want to make sure Illinois state laws are followed. They want to make sure their state laws are followed. They also want to look and see if our policies differ and that the stricter policy is what is being followed. There is a legal formal agreement that has to occur with the single IRB review. Because we are protecting human subjects, we are protecting our researchers, we want to make sure that there are those legal protections in place. So UIS does not engage in a reliance. We will not sign if the other entity does not have an active registration with the Office for Human Research Protections, which is OHRP. So if that is the case, we will not review for them. It would have to be a coordinated review. If it is legally required to be single IRB review, we will ask them to get that registration. Otherwise, we just can't approve it. So single IRB is required for domestic, so United States research at multiple sites above the exempt level. This is a common rule requirement. So obviously other countries do not have that federal rule. That is US only. So we may still use it. It's just not required for that. And again, we'll use it for exempt protocols. If there's a formal agreement, some institutions will not do it for exempt research. We will do it if we need to. It's just not required often for exempt. And again, if there's an active registration with OHRP, we can do that with international sites as well. So we use a system called Smart IRB, and that is preferred if any collaborators are also part of that. It helps us with tracking and requesting this single IRB review. If they are not part of the system, that does not stop us from relying or deferring. We will just sign a different paper that we track a little more manually instead of in the system. Too long, didn't read. Coordinated reviews need the full application submitted to the UIS IRB for the UIS team. External sites get their own. And then single IRB, one application, one lead IRB for everyone. Formal reliance agreement needed. All right, so what that looks like on the research team page, you would select other because they are not affiliated with UIS. And then though it says required city training, 9 times out of 10, it is city training for the other location, but it may not necessarily be. I think my next slide will go more into that, but we will defer to what the other institution's requirement is if they have one. If they do not have a policy, then again, it depends, case by case basis, we can assign an alternate training, which is exactly what I just said. So some examples of what other universities require. So Illinois State University requires city training. It is a different name. I believe they use social behavioral research as their main, unless you're doing something more clinical. Yale requires city training, but they also have 2 alternative trainings that they can submit, not submit to us, but show us that they have done training according to Yale's policy. And then Tuskegee, I searched 3 things in 3 different locations, also requires city. So most of the time, people are using that city training. It is a collaborative effort that a lot of universities do use, so that training is pretty standardized across the board. All right, so I think I've gone into some of these details with coordinating reviews. So don't need to be on the research team form. We do need the approval documents and the informed consent process. There are those extra things to make sure are outlined very clearly. Yep, and then any site changes. I've put that in 2 different slides, almost word for word. So excuse me, I've been sick for the last week. I apologize. For single IRB review, if Reliance is required or opted into, again, make sure everyone is on that research team form, that the relying sites, so the non-lead institutions, are responsible for making sure their own policies are met. They are still in charge of conflicts of interests, for training, compliance. Even though we are overseeing the IRB, they still have to follow the location they are employed, all of their rules and policies. They can't just ignore those. Language should be kept clear, but because there are multiple sites involved, it should be general enough that their policies are met with compliance. So our institution requires that data is maintained for 3 years. Some other institutions may have 5, another may have 7. So instead of specifying that in your consent form, you may say data will be retained at minimum the duration of the institution's policy. So that way it's vague enough that each one is still met, but it's not tying anyone to a 3, 5, or 7-year timeline. When possible, it is through the Smart IRB system, and I'll show you some screenshots of what that site looks like. And when it's not available, the lead IRB will choose what a Reliance agreement looks like. Most institutions have their own template, and non-lead institutions can initiate that, but typically it is the lead IRB. And then again, that OHRP registration, you can check if someone has that. There are 2 different types. One is the federal-wide assurance, which is a larger umbrella, and then they have individual registrations for their IRBs, because some locations that are larger than UIS have more than one on their campus. So again, if they are not affiliated with UIS, Reliance agreement might be required. So there are about 1,200 institutions that participate in the Smart IRB, and you can look up that list. It is linked here as well as on the resource page. If they are part of it, whoever the overall lead investigator is, or someone that they designate on the team, can request investigator access, and the point of contact at that institution can grant their approval for them to join. For the larger consortiums, if the lead institution allows, some sites can sign the Smart IRB Reliance, and some can sign a separate authorization. It does not have to be all 10 sites have to sign the Smart IRB. It can be with an agreement separate with each location. So once account is approved, you can submit information as long as you know it. So it's who is the lead at institution 1, who's the lead at institution 2. What is institution 1 doing? Are they doing just recruitment, and then site 2 is doing data collection? So differentiating the roles at each place is indicated in the Smart IRB portal. Once all that information is submitted, the proposed lead will decide if they will actually lead. So just because it's proposed does not mean that is how it will go. They will accept or decline in the portal. Just because they agree to rely does not mean that it has been approved. So after UIS says, yep, we'll be the lead, then we'll look at everything. Sometimes these can be done simultaneously, but we are trying not to duplicate effort at every institution involved. And then upon approval, the lead institution shares out all of the documents. And then again, that local context review, really making sure that policies are still followed, even if responsibility and oversight is being ceded to another location. So when you log in, there are these different fields. So it's basic information. So you could start the first page, because I hope you know your first and last name, where you work, and what your email and phone number is. So the PI study information is pretty simple. Once you get to the sites involved, you need to have a little more information solidified about your protocol, and knowing who is doing what the responsibilities and roles are, what the scope of work is. And again, this can be initiated in tandem with your application. And then supporting documents can be uploaded, and then a summary is on that last page. So when it is approved, it will show that reliance has been reached. If there are more than one relying site, it will show all of these on one page. This example just has one relying site with UIS as the lead. You can see we know who the reviewing IRB is. We know that the other institution has agreed to rely. An official reliance form is on file, and request history and questions and comments are within this, all from the different points of contact for the IRBs at each location. And then you'll see these cute little check marks. It'll tell you what agreement version it is. There are 3 different versions. Most institutions are using agreement version 1 or 2. Some are using 3, but that just went out earlier this year. So whatever the lowest agreement both institutions use or every multi-site location will use is used. I keep saying that word, I'm so sorry. And then a determination letter is sent to each participating member, just saying that this institution has agreed. They are agreeing to review, but they are not necessarily approving at this point. It is just ceding responsibility. That is the only thing this site does. I feel very repetitive today. My goodness. I think I made this while I was tired. So, or I just want you to get it. I'm repeating it so it's in your heads. So establishing reliance is done through the Smart IRB system, or it can be done through a reliance agreement. This is the first piece of information in UIS's template. So we need to know same information in Smart IRB. Who is the lead? Who is the relying institution? Is it required for funding? Meaning, is it federally funded typically? Are they part of the Smart IRB system? If they are, we'll probably send you that way just because it's a little bit better at auto tracking. We need to know their IRB registration number, their federal-wide assurance number, and then official signers will need to agree to the roles and responsibilities of each location. All right, that is most of the collaboration part before we get deep into the international research and travel policies. Anything in the chat? Anything out loud? I feel like a lot of people have more questions about the international part, which is why that is going super in depth. All right, anything pops up throughout? Yes, Ricky.
Hi there. Just a quick question. What if I'm trying to collaborate with an institution that does not participate at the Smart IRB or any of those institutions, like a non-research kind of institution, like for example, government agency? Do I still have to follow the same kind of template, or it's a different route that I'm going on?
So for the most part, it's the same route. Some government entities do have an IRB or an ethics review committee, so we can still rely on that. If not, it depends. There's alternative methods where we can still serve as the IRB, but it might be more of an individualized reliance instead of an institutionalized alliance. We're actually, we had this come up a couple days ago. So we are working on an alternative template, but still follows the same general format.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're very welcome. So the first thing we think of, or at least I think of with international research, is the physical travel to that location. So if you are traveling on university business, the travelers do need to comply with university regulations, United States, federal, state, as well as any international laws, regulations, and policies. And I do not claim to be an expert on every single country and their regulations. There are way too many to memorize in my lifetime. But you do need to know what those are every time you go somewhere. So one is a federal requirement is the Fly America Act, and this applies if you are traveling on federal funds. So this kind of goes into my grant hat wearing, but if you are traveling internationally to a conference and NSF is paying for it, those are federal funds. So you are required to fly on a US flag air carrier. And if you do not follow, it'll be in your funding agreement what you have to do, but if you don't follow that, they will not reimburse your costs. So there are some exceptions. If there are literally no US flag carriers going to that location, you can fill out a formal exception, but things like ticket cost and convenience are not valid exceptions for the Fly America Act. Travel insurance, this is a bit more recently updated. So traveling on system business requires you to enroll in travel insurance. So when we say system business, this might be a business trip. You might be going to a conference, whether presenting or just attending, faculty exchanges, faculty-led study abroad programs, teaching, research, but this one is mostly about service or sabbaticals. All of those require you to enroll in travel insurance. So for employees, the system does pay for that insurance premium, but the person traveling is required to document it. They have to enroll themselves, gain enrollment confirmation. And while the system level requirement is the same, the actual insurance each campus uses is different. So at UIS, it is Gallagher Travel Health Insurance. And that is, I think, linked on the resource page. That's through the health and insurance page. Not our office, but something that is very important to be aware of. And so when you submit your expense report, if you are familiar with that, we do it through Chrome River, that has to be documented when you submit your expense report. Again, not our department, but still very important and tied together. So export, import, and handling. This is going to sound very heavy, but in about 5 or 7 slides, there will be a little bit of a weight that does get to come off. But there are international traffic and arms regulations. So if you are exporting physical things or information related to defense, articles, services, or technical data, then you are subject to those ITAR regulations. And all technology in the United States is subject to the Export Administration regulations, except for technology under jurisdiction of a different agency. Printed books are not subject to EAR. Publicly available technology is not. If you are creating a technology to be published, it is not subject to that regulation. And any technology that arises during or results from fundamental research, educational technology, or technology in patent applications are not subject to that. So that comes into play very often in a university setting where export control sounds scary, but universities do get a lot of exceptions because research is one of our core values and part of our mission. So when we say export, usually we think of physical things being sent in boxes outside of the United States, but it does include data, information, source codes. Those are considered exports. And restrictions and controls can apply to all of those items. A lot of the big ones are military items or items developed for civilian use, but that military could use. Those are things that the federal government wants to protect very closely. And so there are more restrictions on that. If you are sending anything to an embargoed country, which I will specify later on, those are, again, things the government does not want getting into the wrong hands. So it is very carefully controlled. Encryption technology is one of the things that we do have to be most careful about because our technology does have a lot of encryption technology on it. So be aware that that could be export controlled depending on several factors. And then less common with UIS research, but if we do go more that route, knowing that chemical and biological items, technologies, and services are very carefully guarded by the government. And so it's not a prohibition. We are not saying you can't do it, but there are hoops to jump through in order to take them across safely. So another big one that you may not think about because you're staying in the United States, you're sharing information with people in the United States. You may still need a license if it is a deemed export. So if you are releasing or transferring data technology or source code to a foreign person in the United States, you may need a license in order to share that. So if it is technical data being shared, that is considered an export to the countries where they held or have held or currently hold citizenship or permanent residency. And if it is technology or source code, it's deemed to be an export to their most recent country of citizenship or permanent residency. Again, not prohibited, just might need a little extra, just a paper saying you're allowed to do it, basically. I say a little paper, it is not, it is not the easiest thing to obtain. But if you are giving it to someone, regardless of if they're in country or out, it is a deemed export if it's a parcel, an email even, giving a lab tour to someone, instruction, cloud storage and downloading, payments, funding, and sponsorships. Things we do every day that we don't necessarily think about. You do have to be aware of what's being done with it and what could be done with it in the wrong hands. So when we say foreign person, that does not apply to U.S. citizens, lawful permanent residents, people who have protected categories, refugees, asylees. Those are protected individuals in the United States. This does not apply to entities of the U.S. government, corporations, businesses, or other organizations who have authorization to do business in the United States. So again, most of who we are operating with are not going to require a license. These are obviously allowable in the university setting. Background checks are happening. These are safe people to share with in most instances. And much of university research is exempt from these regulations. One of those exemptions is called the education instruction exception. We are here to educate, and so export control regulations do not apply to information released in academic catalog listed courses or in your teaching labs associated with the courses. Those are things you are teaching publicly to your students who have signed up for that class. Obviously, you are there to share information. The public domain exclusion. Anything in the public domain that has been published, it's available. You don't have to have a license to share it because someone can Google it pretty easily. So ITAR and EAR do exclude that from the requirements. So when we say published or in the public domain, that means it's available generally to the public, the interested public, through libraries, printed media, patent applications are publicly available. If it is information being shared orally at conferences, seminars, anything open to the public or technically qualified public who signs up for it, that is considered published material. And then obviously websites are publicly available. You don't need a license to share that information because it's already there. And then the big one is the fundamental research exemption. So when this research is conducted in the US, it is basic or applied research in sciences, engineering, or math, and you intend to publish the results. That is one of the big ones. That is exempt under the FRE. However, sometimes people will make agreements that restrict publishing rights. That's why we check every contract that goes out in for grants and agreements. We make sure, especially with IP, intellectual property, we need to make sure we're not restricting publication because that does destroy the FRE and may cause you to get those licenses and export controls. So we want to make sure that we are still freely sharing our information. If you need to do confidential information with a grant, we just have to be aware of export controls. So if they are trying to restrict publication, if they require approval, if they don't want you to publish it, that is no longer fundamental research. That is proprietary information. If they are doing citizenship-based restrictions, that is no longer open access. That is no longer fundamental research. It typically goes against the mission of the university. And so you may be subject to those export control regulations. One of the things with the FRE, it does apply to domestic research. So when you say that you're doing international research, that's where we have to get a little more in depth. It seems like we're harping on you, but we're really trying to protect you because some of these fines are massive if something goes wrong. So we will look at what is being exported. Sometimes it's just information. Sometimes it's just your work laptop. A lot of these things are not issues, but it could be depending on where it's going. Some countries have more restrictions than other countries. Who is receiving it? Who are you sharing information with? And then what will it be used for, or what could it be used for if there's a breach in confidentiality? A lot of our work is not harmful. So again, these sound really scary, but in our line of work, a lot of times it is not an issue, but we do just need to check the boxes and make sure we've seen if it could be an issue. So again, not necessarily prohibited, but there is more red tape. A lot of it does come through our federal government. We know the federal government does not work fast. So as soon as possible, let us know if something may require an export control license. If you are doing research where the fundamental research exemption is broken, if they are restricting publication or participation by foreign persons, sometimes it's not done on purpose, but someone agrees to even informally restrict that publication or participation. Even if the contract is not signed, if you have agreed to it informally, it still applies, and we now have to look at export control. Sometimes the contract doesn't get checked very carefully, or the wrong person signs it, and now we have to follow it. So again, putting on my grant hat, that's why we really make sure that you guys are having us look at all those terms and conditions. We have that training, we have that experience. We want to make sure that you are exempted from these export controls whenever possible, because it could end up prohibiting your research if things are not followed. Again, we sound like we're really mean, we're really harping on you, but we want to make sure you can do your research and do it well and not have to take it away after the fact. If you do a Department of Defense grant, if you are working with the FBI for whatever reason, we need to know if you're developing military, intelligence, or dual use applications, meaning it not only has civilian use, it also has military applications that it could be used for. If you are doing research with other controlled items beyond what is exempted. If you are traveling to an embargoed country for research or establishing relationships on behalf of the university, or exporting controlled items, whether it's information, materials, equipment, or deemed exports, these may need a license. Again, can be done with the proper allowances. But again, federal government does not work fast. So they don't have a deadline. They could take a year to get you a license or even review your license. And there's not even a guarantee they'll approve it. So usually these are much deeper research protocols, and you know that they're coming down the line, especially if you've applied for a grant. They take 6 months to review it. They take 2 months to negotiate a contract. This can be ongoing as those other negotiations are happening in the background. We can get that started. And again, some could wait 16 months. Some could get you a license in 2 days. But again, there's not even a guarantee that it will be approved. So I couldn't find a really good spot for this, but things to be aware of with our fundamental research exception is you're usually going to travel with your laptop, your phone, some other sort of GPS-enabled device. And those contain encryption technology. It has software. So those are things to be aware of, especially in countries that have restrictions on that. So it does have to be shown and proven that it's used for work. It's a tool of the trade. If it is not in support of your work, don't take it. It's just going to enact all those restrictions that you don't need necessarily. If you're going to an embargoed country, I think there are only 5 embargoed countries. So if you're going there, try not to take these items. Make sure they are on your physical person at all times, so there is no breach in confidentiality. It doesn't get stolen or accessed by the wrong people. And then it does have to be back in the United States within 12 months. So when possible, if you can take a laptop that is swept clean of everything except basic software and data, make sure it's not on the hard drive. Those can be accessed pretty easily in a lot of countries, or they can wipe it completely. So make sure that you are accessing the university's protected network, as long as it's allowed in the other country. There are some countries that don't allow that encryption technology. So again, it depends. Make sure you know what it is in each location. Why am I going so hard on this? Because they apply not just when you are physically international, it's when you are working with international locations, or international people. And it is the responsibility of the researcher. A lot of things are the responsibility of the university. The university makes agreements on your behalf, but these are items where it is up to the individual, and the individual can be fined and liable for these. So we do have an international research checklist. I don't think anyone likes to do it, but it does go through a lot of the ins and outs that you might not be familiar with. So some of the things that are on that are completing that international research module. That goes into the basics of what you need to know no matter what country you're going to, or researching with, or conversing with. One quiz, minimum 80%. You should look at the international standards specific to that location. I think it is the Office of Human Research Protections compiles this list. There are 1,200 different standards in about 130 different countries. So you don't have to read for every single country, just specific to what is there, because you have to comply with our laws, state policy, UIS policy, as well as those in that other location. And if they do conflict, or one is stricter than the other, we will say follow the more strict standard. So in some cultures, written language isn't used. It is all oral, or signed consent is not the norm, or it is a cause for concern if it gets into the wrong hands in those countries. So the IRB at UIS may be able to waive that requirement for signature without relaxing our standard for ethical conduct and obtaining a meaningful consent. So again, those big old pages about export control, sometimes they don't apply, but you do need to know if it does. So we may ask you to complete that city training if it sounds like you're doing work with military services, if there might be a dual use, if you are taking biological materials across borders. We may ask you to take that export control just so you know the basics. And know what is exempt. That is important to know, because not that we get away with a lot, but we're allowed to do a lot more based on our university mission and values. And then these are things that are updated literally daily. Know if there's a travel advisory, an embargo on that country, or some sort of sanction that limits areas or items. I will go into each of those a little more in depth. I think we've got the time. Because we are not experts in every country, every entity, every community group, we will ask you to find an expert in that area and correspond with them. Get in contact with them. A lot of those international standards will give you a starting place, but if you already have a contact, they can put you in contact with a local ethics committee if they don't have one in that country, maybe an expert, a community leader who has to grant you permission to be there. These are things you need to understand. You need to know the local customs, the norms, the laws, what you can and can't do just speaking to people. And then we just need to see sorry guys, we need to see that you have started that conversation. There are cultural sensitivities to be aware of. Some countries where the economic status is lower, there's a larger chance for coercion if you are giving a monetary compensation for your research. That might be undue influence that they wouldn't participate otherwise, but they really need that money. So be aware of that. If it's an area that is currently engaging in war, or recently did, or there are different dynamics of who can talk to men, women, or children, be aware of that. Literacy rates can impact the way that you get informed consent, or the level of understanding, especially if there's a language difference. Be aware of that. Again, those roles of women and children. You might have to take another researcher to speak to someone that in that culture you can't talk to, and that should be addressed in your protocol. If you need a translator, you need to make sure they are qualified, that they are translating correctly. So you wouldn't, get a child who's going to change the meaning of what your informed consent is. And you need to address confidentiality and privacy because you've now just given another person access to protected data. So a non-disclosure agreement may need to be developed between UIS and the translator, especially if you don't speak the language. This is big if you don't speak the language of the people you're researching. So the challenges with this, I'm gonna kind of go into these more. So language proficiencies can create barriers. There might be miscommunications. Even if you have very clearly given this informed consent and recruitment to us in English, any slight mistranslation or turn of phrase that gets translated differently, any idioms that don't translate directly can change the interpretation, which can cause issues. If there are local privacy laws that are more or less restrictive, the norms are different, as well as in the culture. What is considered sensitive? Will you offend someone who is the age of majority in another country? If they are considered an adult at 16 and you ask for parent signature, I'm an adult, you could offend their cultural norms. Making sure data storage capabilities are taken into consideration. Is the government controlling what is being shared over the cloud, which is an increased risk for unauthorized access? Do the community dynamics even allow for anonymity? Is there a cultural leader that has to be there that you can't interview someone privately? That is something to be aware of. Is there governmental oversight? And is there any sort of coercion based on power or compensation or other factors? I feel like I'm going in such a weird order. I'm so sorry. The information is good. The order is just a little iffy. So travel advisories are listed by the Department of State, and these are ratings of risk level in a country for U.S. travelers. So as of last night, the top newest ones were in Greenland is a level 2, which is exercise increased caution. That is due to weather. There's some weather issues in Greenland. In Tunisia, it's also a level 2, but that is due to terrorism along the borders. Level 3 in Uganda is also reconsidered travel. That is also due to terrorism, but it is more rampant throughout the country. In Senegal, it's a level 1, exercise normal precautions. There's a little bit of an advisory, and that is to increased crime and landmines. So each of those are updated pretty frequently. You can see just in the last 2 weeks, those have been updated on the Department of State website. Sanctions and embargoes are more like penalties, trade restrictions, asset freezes, or travel bans. Sanctions are to certain items or regions, whereas embargoes is to a larger area. So Afghanistan had some related sanctions. I don't remember what those were, but these are just smaller things. You can still travel there, but there are certain things you can't take or certain people you cannot converse with. And these are listed by the Office of Foreign Assets Control. And those embargoes are comprehensive, larger sanctions against countries and regions. Like I said, there's only 5 embargoed areas currently, and that's Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Syria, and then 3 regions in the Ukraine. And then even more specific is the restricted and denied parties list. This is for individuals. You do not necessarily have to do this yourself because there are more than 50 restricted and denied party lists just in the United States. But our office does have access to a visual compliance website that will check all 50 of those lists really quickly. So if we screen something, it's usually someone's name and their country or affiliation, and it pops up with like a red flag, then we may ask for more information. We might ask for their resume or CV so we can see if it's a match. Because it might just be someone who has the same name with a red flag. So we have to go through all these steps to make sure it's not a match. And if it is, you probably can't work with that person or entity because they have been denied or restricted by a government entity. So I mentioned the international standards, which has over 1,000 standards for 130 countries. It does not claim to be exhaustive or current because they are constantly changing, and that's 130 countries that are constantly changing. So just make sure that you are consulting with those authorities and the committees in those countries. I've got time. I think I can get through these. So there are different standards for different regions, and then it goes even more specific with those. So a couple of these are ones I've actually had to do relatively recently. We had a researcher working with a collaborator in Malawi. So I had to contact the National Health Science Research Committee to see if they needed to review it. They already had IRB review at an institution there. So through a couple months of conversation, we were able to establish reliance, and the Malawi University is taking over that research protocol. We had a researcher going to Bangladesh. This was also another one. It takes a few months because the Bangladesh ethics committee never got back to us. So we had to find a university there that could review it and say, this is not required to be approved at our level, but we have looked at it, and UIS level research wasn't enough for us. So we said, okay, you're allowed, you're good. We have a few researchers that have shown interest in going to Europe and doing research with the European collaborators. The things you need to be aware of is where in Europe, if they are part of the EU or the European Economic Area, there are certain privacy laws that are pretty in-depth. And then Latin America, the Caribbean, those also have a lot of different laws. So we need to be aware of those. So I mentioned data privacy laws. This is one of the ones where I give you way too much information. But we will ask you if GDPR applies, which is the General Data Protection Regulations, which applies to all countries in the EU, the European Union, and other European Economic Area. And it is more stringent privacy and security laws for personal data of people within the EU. So you guys are very smart people. You can read these yourself. But there are a lot of things that go into it. And if it is personally identifiable information, that is what's going to be more strictly controlled by this regulation. The bold thing here is if it is anonymous, if you do not need to collect that data for your research, it is not restricted by the GDPR. So if we're doing all of this, obviously we want you to consult with a person in the country you're going to, but if it can be anonymous, make it anonymous. It's going to make the regulations a lot easier to follow and meet. And then again, age of consent in the EU is 16 under GDPR. So you need to be aware of that different cultural practice. Just because there's 7 minutes left. A lot of things that are more strict with the GDPR, if your protocol absolutely has to collect personally identifiable information to be good research, it's more explicit consent. You have to give a lot more options to not only withdraw, but also after the fact, have their data expunged, as long as you haven't already made it anonymous or de-identified. You have to have a very comprehensive data management and security plan, which here we don't require necessarily unless it is a grant agreement or if it is a clinical trial. You need to make sure they know their data is not going to stay in the EU or the economic area. So it's a lot more, I guess stringent is a good word for this. So you need to know what's happening in that country. And fines can be up to 20 million euros, which is $20 million. So again, this is why we kind of go hard into you on these. Up to, not necessarily if it's a minor accidental thing. Another one is PIPL, which we'll call PIPL, which applies to the People's Republic of China if you are doing research there, either physically or if you are collecting data over the internet online. If they are there, PIPL applies. Again, anonymized information is not under this law, but it does have to be super anonymized. You cannot have a code, you cannot reverse it. It has to be completely unrelated or unconnected to that person. This has extra things if the child is under the age of 14. So again, cultural things to be aware of. But again, this can apply to being within the People's Republic of China, but also if you are researching over borders, even if you are not physically there, if your subject is, it applies. Again, one time. I probably need to separate these into two different trainings. So again, there are just slightly stricter laws. There needs to be a deletion of personal information when it's no longer necessary. If the purpose of it changes, if other laws require it, if they revoke consent after the fact, you have to delete it. There's no if, ands, or buts. It has to be done. And it's just under these principles that we typically hold with our ethics, but it is more explicitly labeled in this law, the lawfulness, fairness, necessity, good faith. All of that applies under people. It's a long one. I didn't want to give you the whole law. But violations of this could be, for minor ones, up to 1 million yuan, which is about $157,000. And for serious higher level matters, it could be up to 50 million yuan, which is up to $8 million. So we don't want you charged for that because, again, individuals are liable, not the institution. Okay. Because the closest I've come to actually going to time on this. That's heavy. It's a lot of information. So a lot of it is just reach out the second you know you want to do something collaboratively or internationally, just because the more people and locations get involved, the more requirements may be there for the different locations. And we have to do our due diligence to make sure everyone involved is protected and safe and ethically treated is what it really comes down to. So there were a lot of resources that I mentioned. So UIS does have a lot of forms, so you don't have to go through all of these. But if you are curious or want a more in-depth look at it, these are the websites where I pulled a lot of my information. Some of it is copied word for word so that I did not miscommunicate the information. City training is as annoying as it can be to finish and get those certificates. It really is helpful because it is specifically related to university human subjects research. The OHRP registration status database, if they don't have an FWA or it is expired, you can know that. So actually Malawi's was expired, and so we could not form a reliance. They went in and got it renewed, and so it was able to be completed and signed. Smart IRB, super underutilized, but very helpful. Travel insurance policy just got updated, so there's a link to that. Travel insurance, the Fly America Act, all of these controlled items are listed on different websites and updated pretty frequently. And I think that's the last one. But anything else that's not confusing or is confusing or not there, email us. That's really what it comes down to. We've got a lot of people in the office ready to answer your questions. I'll stick around for the last 2 minutes. Nothing in the chat. Good deal.
Thank you, Carissa, for this wonderful presentation.
What was that?
Thank you for this wonderful presentation, very comprehensive.
It's a big thing, and I think now that people are traveling internationally a lot more, it's very timely.
I'm just curious, for example, if you do not have international collaboration, but for example, I originally come from China, sometimes I travel back, visit my parents, occasionally maybe, some university ask me to give a, presentation. Do we have specific regulation regarding, for example, I take the UIS laptop?
So it depends on what's on the laptop, basically. So as long as it's not, you're not giving the laptop to people, they don't have access to the data on it. If you have it locked down, password protected, it's typically not an issue. It becomes an issue if someone hacks the computer and they can see your data. It's an issue if someone steals the computer, and that's where we need to get not our office involved, but probably some other offices, IT, potentially even the police department involved, but making sure that anything that was obtained is not dangerous in those hands. Yes. All right, you guys are good to go. I don't claim to be an expert, but I am great at digging and finding answers or asking the right people. So my email or the ORA email are always open.